fight song of the UConn Huskies, and this is the Rush the Court podcast. I'm your podcast host, Shane. Alongside me in person is my podcast partner, Randy. And Randy, we start with the UConn Huskies because this is the last official podcast that we're talking about the 2013-2014 season. After this, it's all looking forward, but we do want to wrap up the summer. We do want to wrap up everything that's happened since the Huskies cut down the nets, and then we'll move forward. So we have to start with the Huskies, pay our homage to them one last time before we make them earn it all over again heading into this season. Randy, how's your summer been?
Yeah, man. All of our faithful listeners, we've definitely missed reaching out to you guys for the past 6 months, but Shane was making his rounds here on the West Coast, and we got to meet up here in person, and I can just let everyone know, I know they're not going to be surprised when I found you in the bar. Shane said, come over to my hotel. I found him in the bar. And for all the ladies out there that have been pining away for Shane to ultimately ask them out and be their date in the future, well, let me just say that he has a voice for radio. That's for sure. No, I'm just kidding. Summer was good. You know, I barely remember what happened after UConn cut the nets down. It was all I know is it was 4 a.m. and I was writing a story, and then everything since then has been a complete blur. So I probably am going to forget a lot of things, but you'll be there to help me out throughout this podcast.
That's what this podcast is for. Those of you who everything in the summer has been a blur. Maybe you've been preoccupied with other sports that we don't really know about here, whether that's baseball, football. I don't know. I've heard rumors of these things, Randy. I don't really know too much about them. But maybe if that's preoccupied, you haven't seen all the headlines, you've kind of tuned out since UConn cut down the nets. This podcast will catch you up on everything that's happened the last few months, Randy. And of course, kind of, there's been so many headlines around all of sports. But one of the reasons why college basketball has kind of flown under the radar is I feel like this summer there haven't been the major headlines. Every other sport you've seen the major headlines, you know, for the better or for worse, with the NFL and college football and all the controversies and off the field stuff. You know, I'm happy that college basketball hasn't had that, even if it means a little less time in the national spotlight and a few less minutes on SportsCenter over the summer. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. We did have a little bit of a controversy maybe about a month ago with Coach K and Team USA and Adrian Wojnarowski saying that, you know, he's the real winner of Team USA. And Coach K was not shy in fighting back on that, you know, talking about how the guys like Billy Donovan and Shaka Smart and Tony Bennett, who coach the younger Team USA teams, if anything, have more of a benefit than him because of the fact that they are coaching guys who are the top prospects in high school. Jim Boeheim came out and defended Coach K. Of course, Jim Boeheim as an assistant coach also maybe gets a little advantage. But, I mean, here's the thing, Randy. If that's your biggest controversy, and you can weigh in on that, I mean, that's not a very controversial summer.
No, we had the National Felons League sort of filling the space all through much of the second half of the summer. We had some Jameis Winston activity still ongoing with college football. And what's up with the state of Mississippi, by the way? I mean, that's kind of absurd. We ran a little bit of a crowdsourcing yesterday on Twitter about what would be the equivalent of a Mississippi State in basketball being number one, just a program with no history whatsoever in the sport. And we can talk about that a little bit later as well to see what folks had to say. They had some good feedback there. The couple things in college basketball that stuck out to me was silence, as you mentioned, just not a lot going on. LeBron, of course, took his talents back to Cleveland, and a certain college basketball coach didn't follow him. That was newsworthy. And even though Rex Chapman went on record, of course, during the Final Four saying he would, he was talking about the Lakers, but it didn't happen. I guess the understanding is that he was very close to thinking about it before LeBron actually made his decision. Of course, we're talking about Mr. Calipari, but he did not choose to move on. So, you know, not a lot what happened. Maybe the one thing sort of in the background, not just in college basketball, but football that caught my eye this summer was the Ed O'Bannon case. That was ruled in favor of the players, and so they will be Of course, that's going to go to appeal, possibly all the way up to the Supreme Court level in the next year or two. But the case basically said that they have a right to be compensated for the use of their likenesses, which makes sense, right? Northwestern has their thing going with the football players and the National Labor Relations Board with respect to unionizing. So it's just, again, kind of chipping away, right, at the NCAA and their student athlete theory of business, and what is this thing going to look like in the next 3 to 5 years as these cases continue to kind of sort of fall on the side of the athlete, and the money that's all flowing to these, what they're calling now the Power 5 leagues, it continues to grow. So
yeah, you mentioned Power 5. Also, that's the autonomy, which you will see. I mean, if they are able to compensate athletes at least, with cost of living scholarships is what they talk about a lot. So a little bit more than just room and, what it takes to pay for the classes. Does that create more of a divide between the teams in those conferences and the slightly less? Does it put a school like UConn, who's not in a Power 5 as it stands now, at a little bit more of a disadvantage? I think they'll be okay, but maybe a school like SMU, who's trying to be on the up, coming up. UConn's established, SMU not quite as much. Does it hurt them in terms of trying to get themselves established in that upper echelon outside of the top 5? That'll be something interesting to see. Now, we don't even know what autonomy will mean for the Power 5 conferences, but it'll be interesting for schools like SMU when they do start enacting some of their own rules.
You have to wonder about these basketball-first schools like UConn, like Memphis in the American. I'm worried about the Big East, honestly. People aren't talking about the Big East anymore when they mention college basketball. It's like Georgetown and Villanova. These are schools with a lot of basketball history, with national championships, Final Fours, and nobody's even talking about them. And I'm worried about sort of the haves and the have-nots. That's going to be a difficult situation for those schools to navigate in the next few years as the Power 5 continue to move forward.
Well, Randy, I mentioned SMU a second ago, and one of the big headlines from this summer was involving SMU and about a guy who will never play college basketball, and that's Emmanuel Mudiay. Obviously, he was a top prospect. Larry Brown had convinced him to go to SMU. Is probably the biggest moment in SMU basketball history in terms of off the court stuff, definitely. And things were really looking up for SMU. They're already going to be bringing back a lot of pieces. They're going to have a nice team, but Mudiay was thought to be the guy that would take them from being a nice team, a quality team, probably an NCAA tournament team, maybe in that 5 to 9 range in terms of seeds, to a team that could be a top 4 seed, a team that could be really a contender. But Mudiay, whether it was due to eligibility concerns, whether it was something else, is now going to be playing in China, and then will be going to the NBA from China. So we're never going to see him playing college basketball. Randy, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, it's a shame because a lot of it is supposedly linked to the school that he went to in Texas, and it wasn't really his fault. It wasn't like he was skipping class it was basically he was duped into this school from Deion Sanders. It ended up being very credible.
Prime time, still getting over on people.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so that kind of hurt him, but it sucks. This is going to be a college basketball season where we don't have a lot of established stars, unlike last year. And even some of the freshmen don't have quite the name value that Wiggins and Parker had going into last year. He would have been one that did. Now we don't get to see him.
No, it is disappointing from that perspective. And you always wonder what are the driving forces behind these decisions for some of these kids. He is not a kid that grew up in the United States his whole life. So his family did come from overseas. I think they're probably a little more comfortable with the idea of, sort of having a view of the world that's worldly, so to speak, as opposed to, say, Brandon Jennings, right, who went overseas and played for his 1 year, and it's by all accounts, it was a complete disaster. He just didn't know how to deal with the culture shock, with the language issues. Whereas Mudiay might, not that he, I don't know, maybe knows Chinese, maybe he doesn't, but maybe just a more worldly view of things. He'll be able to fit in a little bit better. I still think it's going to be really tough. He'll be drafted, of course, regardless. Jeremy Tyler was another kid that came out a few years back, and I think I saw him at the end of some NBA team's bench recently.
That'd be my New York Knicks.
Yeah, your New York Knicks. There you go. I don't think he plays much. But again, this is happening maybe once every couple of years where a guy is choosing to go overseas. There was talk when, I guess when Brandon Jennings did it, that there might be a flood of these guys. But it's really not the greatest, other than the money. And I'm sure you and I would both gladly take $1.2 million in an Under Armour contract. But other than that, I just think it's real difficult for a lot of the kids. So I don't think it's going to create any kind of floodgate situation. It's just disappointing that SMU is not going to be what we thought they could be this year.
Yeah. Well, going from a guy who we thought we would see in college next year but won't, to guys that we didn't think we were going to see in college this year but we will. And that is a couple guys on Kentucky in the Harrison twins and Willie Cauley-Stein choosing to return.
Yeah.
And Randy, this team is going to be loaded, and we'll talk plenty about how loaded they are, and how that will work, and the 9 McDonald's All-Americans they will have on their team next year. We'll talk plenty of that over the coming weeks as we turn more into preview. But how surprised were you that the Harrisons now? Early in the season, probably early, like January, February, we would have thought the Harrisons were gone because Cal wanted them gone, and everyone hated them in Kentucky, and then everything was going bad at that point in time. They seemed to really draw the ire of a lot of Kentucky fans, and they weren't playing great, either of them, and that seemed to be an issue. So it kind of seemed like no matter what their draft stock is, they would have gone, and Kentucky fans would have driven them to the airport. Then we roll through March and early April, and they become the heroes of this great run to the finals. And you're thinking, well, now their stock is great, and they'll leave because they're going to be, top half of the first-round draft picks. And they're going to, leave for NBA riches, which is probably the plan when they came to Kentucky. But yet, somehow, but between both those scenarios, they've actually chosen to return to Lexington.
Yeah, and Calipari said he was surprised himself that those two guys, as well as Willie Cauley-Stein, chose to come back, and that's why he now has this surplus of McDonald's All-Americans, and he's talking about doing line changes with his team because he's got so many guys that need to see some run during the games. The Harrison kids, we talked about them all the time last year, up and down and up and down, and just a scintillating march for those two guys to really lead Kentucky into the final game and have a chance to win the championship after a really up and down season. But I can't imagine, honestly, that they're going to have a better opportunity stock-wise than they would have had coming out in April. I mean, because they had been down so much, and then it sort of clicked for them. The jump shots were falling. I mean, how many in a row did they win on a 3 at the buzzer, pretty much, in NCAA tournament when everybody's watching? So I didn't understand it. I mean, I just feel like this is going to be one of our recurring themes throughout the preseason, not only with the Harrison twins, but this Kentucky team. They're preseason number 1 on a lot of the polls, probably all of the polls, Shane, maybe even our poll. But are they the team that was an 8 seed? Are they more like that team, or are they more like the team that ran through March all the way to the final game? And I think that's going to be a major emphasis of our discussion over the coming weeks.
Now, quickly on Cauley-Stein, he seems like the kind of guy that always leaves you wanting more. You can see he's so athletic, so talented. He'll do some stuff. I mean, he can be dominant on the defensive end, and then every once in a while you'll see a glimpse on the offensive end. Will we see in year 3 for Cauley-Stein him put it all together, or is he just bound to be one of those guys that forever will tantalize you, but will never, whether it's in college or maybe even in the NBA, never quite put it all together?
I kind of wonder if again, him staying and from a personal standpoint hurts him a little bit, because Cal can take him out this year. If his head isn't in the game and he's giving you one of those 4-point, 2 rebound, 1 block type of performances, he can bring in Dakari Johnson. He can bring in Karl Towns. He can bring in a lot more talent. Marcus Lee is still on the team. He can bring in all these big athletic guys to do similar type things that Cauley-Stein brought to the table. That 2 years ago, when Cauley-Stein was a freshman, he was the only guy they had like that, right? I mean, more or less. And last year they had more of those guys, but he was really the guy that we were looking at to make the leap and become a double-double machine and certainly a defensive dynamo. But I wonder if he's mentally checked out of certain games, if he's just going to get pulled, and because of that, he won't have an opportunity maybe to build that consistency you're talking about.
Now, we talked about the Harrisons, talked about Cauley Stein. Those were guys who had their high draft stock at the end of the year, but also went into the year with a high draft stock. One guy who had a very high draft stock through the NCAA tournament, but didn't enter the season with one, is Frank Kaminsky.
Yeah.
I mean, we talked about him a lot.
Frank
He had that 40-whatever point game in November. That's kind of what put him on the map, and then had a solid year the rest of the year, and then obviously in the NCAA tournament went bonkers, had just a sensational tournament, and he actually explained his decision not to go pro when everyone thought he should, just because his stock will never be higher than it was last spring. He wrote or said at the time, "I'm at the pinnacle of my basketball playing career, at least in my eyes. I know the NBA has their crazy fans and all, but if you look at all their games, there are games when teams like the Bobcats hardly have any fans, and it looks flat out boring. At the Kohl Center, we play in front of nearly 17,000 fans every single time we step onto the court. When we travel, we play in front of sellout crowds who absolutely hate us, not because of who is on the team, but because of where we go to school. Who could leave that?" And Randy, while some may criticize, his decision to potentially pass at millions of dollars, not capitalize on his high draft stock, I will always love Frank Kaminsky because he encapsulated what makes college basketball great in just a few lines right there. I love it.
I think we can take that quote and just put it at the top of the site, right? I mean, it represents, if you're listening to this podcast, that quote probably reaches out and speaks to you as well. I mean, it's why we love college basketball, which is not to say it's the enemy of the NBA or anything like that, or you can like both, but there is a certain amount of pageantry and passion, and you only play 30 games and your fans are a little more into it because they're college kids and they're crazy, and it just feels more meaningful on a night-to-night basis. And I think Frank really captured that with that statement, and I'm glad to see him back.
Yeah, him and Sam Decker also returned to Wisconsin, which is why you're going to see them in a lot of people's top fives, maybe even top threes, as we get ready for the season. But I can see them back.
The question, Shane, is he destined to become this year's McGarry?
Yeah, well, speaking of McGarry, another Big Ten team, a team that got everyone back. Last year at this time we were talking about how they got everyone back. Pretty much everyone besides Trey Burke, who was on the borderline, decided to come back, and they're going to be great. And certainly Michigan had a good year, but probably not for the reasons people necessarily were expecting at this time last year. When you had their big three sophomores at the time decide to come back with McGarry and Glenn Robinson III and Stauskas. Stauskas wasn't even really considered part of the big three. Ultimately, he was the one that should have come back, did come back, and capitalized it. McGarry and Glenn Robinson didn't have their great years. Obviously, McGarry getting hurt and then ultimately suspended, which kind of forced him into declaring for the draft. So I'm sure neither of those guys had sophomore years that they were happy with. But now they're all gone. So no matter how you want to slice it, that's three big pieces gone for the Wolverines. Obviously, we saw a lot from Carousel last year. They do have some pieces that we're familiar with, that were successful last year. But for the third year in a row, second year in a row, I guess, you're trying to replace a high-volume shooter, high-volume scorer that also creates for everyone else. I mean, we saw a lot from Karis LeVert last year, but a lot of that was off of what Nick Stauskas was able to do. 2 years ago, you had Trey Burke kind of create everything, starting the offense, being the guy that defenses had to key in on. Last year, that was Stauskas. I mean, can they replace that again, especially when you're losing other key pieces like Robinson, like McGarry, even though he didn't really play last year. Even Horford transferring was a guy who played a lot of minutes for them, even though he wasn't a great player or anything like that. Can Michigan kind of move forward without those big pieces is something that's really going to be interesting to watch this year.
Yeah, John Beilein has shown that he can sort of develop players and get them to make a leap when you don't expect it. Even Trey Burke, when he came in, nobody thought he was going to be player of the year in 2 years. Nobody even thought he was that good. He was, the 80th ranked recruit. Maybe, as you mentioned, Karis LeVert makes a leap this year that we didn't see coming. He's pretty good, but I don't know if he's going to make a Stauskas type leap. Derek Walton, maybe there's some other guys. that they've got on the recruiting trail that will surprise. But I do feel McGarry was kind of the guy they needed to come back. He didn't play much last year. He certainly was a core of that team that went to the finals 2 years ago and could have probably provided a little bit of a bridge between that core now being all gone to the next group of Michigan Wolverines.
And another team that lost 3 key pieces, UCLA.
Yeah.
And very different UCLA. So you had Kyle Anderson, who I think before even coming to college, his dad was on record saying he was going to spend 2 years and then leave. Which, in the era of one and done, it seemed admirable. Whether he kind of did what his dad was hoping for those 2 years, I don't know. I mean, he was a pretty good player. Went towards the end of the first round. He went to the Spurs, so he's probably going to be amazing in the NBA now, just because he went to the Spurs.
Right. Perfect system for him.
But that one, was maybe the most expected. I think most Bruin fans were probably ready for that one. Then you had 2 more curious cases a little bit. Zach LaVine was a guy who the NBA, scouts loved. They loved his pro potential, but definitely probably frustrating if you're a UCLA fan in the sense that you never got to experience the full Zach LaVine as a great player. I mean, we talked about him. We talked about our guys that we loved watching last year, and LaVine was one of those guys for me. We both on him early as one of the most exciting players in college basketball, and you've seen some of the things he's done in NBA Summer League, and now he's lighting up a whole new audience. They're starting to pay attention to what he's able to do, but still never put it all together on the court as a complete player for UCLA. So I'm sure if you're a Bruins fan, you're a little disappointed that you never got to see that. You would hope that he could have made a leap into all Pac-12 type of player this year if he came back. And then also frustrating, Jordan Adams, probably the best player of the 3 last year, initially says he's coming back, which everyone's like, okay, so we're losing LaVine, we're losing slow-mo, but maybe, Adams is the best of the bunch. We'll get him back. We'll be okay. Then ultimately changes his mind, decides to go pro, even though he's not even considered a great NBA prospect. I mean, if you're a UCLA fan, how are you feeling losing those 3 guys? And is one of them more frustrating than the other? I mean, it's kind of a tough spot for UCLA.
And you make a really good point about LaVine, because you feel like Alford didn't really trust him last year to play him in key moments, and then you still didn't get the payoff on him, right? The second year where he starts to be more consistent and develops into a regular who could be an all Pac-12 type of player, and then he's gone, right? And so you hardly knew him, so to speak. And certainly agree with you on Adams. I mean, again, he would have been a great bridge guy. They're bringing in a guy named Kevon Looney, who's an elite recruit. They do return a few other players, both in terms of Parker on the inside as well as the coach's son on the perimeter. I think they'll be okay. They turned out to be a Sweet 16 team last year, which, maybe that was about their peak. They probably could have gone a little further if they had the right matchup. Your Florida Gators took care of them pretty handily. But I think that the Bruins have enough returning and incoming talent to be okay. But it might be a little bit of what could have been, too, for the Bruins this year, particularly with losing Adams and LaVine.
And so that's kind of the guys who went to the NBA draft. There's plenty more one-offs here and there but a few months later, it's tough to break down every single decision. We'll get into the guys that came back and didn't come back and their impact as we get into more of the preview for this season. But those were some of the big teams that were impacted, not just by one guy, but by multiple guys for the NBA draft. With those 4 teams there. But Randy, you kind of alluded to it in the opening of the show, and to me, one of the biggest stories was the coaching carousel is always a big story. And there was certainly some movement. We caught some of that at the tail end of last year in terms of, Buzz Williams going to Virginia Tech and kind of the oddity of that move. Konzo Martin kind of with some self-preservation going out to Cal, leaving.
These coaches are doing this more and more, right? Like leaving
Bruce Pearl going to Auburn. We caught that since then, despite for most of his time not being able to recruit, was somehow pulling in recruit after recruit after recruit and transfer after transfer. So kudos to Bruce Pearl. He's already got that thing humming down at Auburn. But I think the biggest thing for me on the coaching carousel is the guys that didn't move.
Right.
You alluded to Coach Cal, who had a chance to go to the Cavs pre-LeBron returning.
Yep.
He has come out and said that if he knew LeBron was going, he still wouldn't have gone. I don't believe that.
I don't either.
I mean, that's what you have to say.
That's when you go.
That's what you have to say now. But, I mean, I think he definitely would have gone. Fred Hoiberg, Kevin Ollie, two of the bright young coaches in college basketball. Obviously, Ollie, now the defending champion, the guy whose team we started off this podcast with. Both guys who were really top NBA prospects in terms of coaches. Ollie's was a longtime veteran. Hoiberg was a veteran, obviously, but also worked in NBA front offices with the Timberwolves. Timberwolves had a head coach opening. A lot of people thought Hoiberg might go there. Didn't ultimately. Hoiberg said he talked to the Warriors before they went with Kerr. Ollie, this is the one that surprised me. I mean, and both Ollie and Hoiberg are interesting because they're at their alma maters. So you know they're not going to leave for just any job. But Ollie's a guy who's from L.A. You had a chance to maybe go to the Lakers.
Yep.
I don't know that the Lakers actually ended up ever offering him the job. It seemed like, from what I know, there's a little bit of miscommunication and a lot of different opinions in that Lakers front office of which way they wanted to go. I don't know that they ever made Ollie an offer, but I think that would have been maybe the one NBA job. I think if you're a UConn fan, you could really wipe the sweat off your brow because that's, I think, the one job that could have enticed him to leave his alma mater. He's an LA guy.
Yeah.
There are not many NBA jobs, if any, that are better than being the Lakers head coach, especially if you're from LA. That could have been the one. I mean, and if you're Kevin Ollie, one NCAA tournament, 2 years, one championship. I mean,
where do you go from there?
I mean, why even bother tarnish your record? Jump straight to the NBA and try to see if you can be one and win a championship there. But he stays. Hoiberg stays. Calipari stays. It's come out that both Izzo and Bill Self were approached by NBA teams, as I'm sure they are most off seasons.
Right.
They've obviously stayed. So it could have been a really crazy summer in terms of coaching changes.
All it takes is one of those guys, and then you really set into motion the domino effect. I will say about Ollie, right? I mean, we talked about him 2 years ago in this very spot, and we said he's in a position to fail with UConn. And boy, was that on target. He's sitting there with a national championship ring.
We're really smart, Randy.
Yeah, we are.
Really smart.
But maybe he saw a little bit of the writing on the wall with the Lakers, and they've committed to Kobe for 2 more years, and Kobe's not going to be what we think of as Kobe. I don't care how many German cryogenic chambers he's been through and bariatric treatments with his knee. But maybe he figured that really was going to be a position where he's set up to fail. And because they're not going to be able to bring in free agents because of Kobe's salary for the next couple of years, and they've got a bunch of guys like Xavier Thames, Wes Johnson, now Julius Randle, young guys who aren't ready to maybe be winners in the NBA just yet. So, I agree with you. Maybe he's looking down the road, though, 2 or 3 years, and the Lakers job opens up again. That might be the right spot for him. And he's obviously shown he's clever, and he can figure it out. So I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt on sticking with UConn here.
Yeah, and I know. See, here's the thing, too. It's tough. I mean, Kevin Ollie gets a huge contract extension from UConn after they're winning the championship. But you look at what he got compared to what Steve Kerr, who has never coached a game in his life, got as a first-time head coach for the Warriors. And you realize why it's enticing to go to the NBA. Besides, obviously, they'll always say, higher level basketball, want to prove yourself at the highest level basketball, coaching, all that stuff. The money in the NBA compared to college, even though we know college makes a lot of money, all that jazz, it's still a different level. Yeah. It's just not the same. So that's why you're always going to be nervous. If you're a team with a head coach that NBA teams deem as a good potential candidate, you always have to be a little nervous because – listen, as you and I sit here, I mean, yes, $3 million if Kevin Ollie making that's a lot of money. But guess what? $6 million is double that amount. I mean, whatever you're making, if someone offers you double and you could even still spin it as a raise, you're going to think long and hard about it. So that's why you always have to be a little nervous. I mean, sometimes, people say, why would you ever leave? Why would especially it's your alma mater. You run everything. You could have everything you ever want. You got this thing humming. Why would you leave? Hey, think about you. You could be comfortable in your job. Someone offers you double, and it's maybe a better job. It's tough to just say no without even thinking about it.
And you win the title in your second year as a head coach. I would understand if you're pretty high on your abilities as a head coach. But I still have concerns about Connecticut long term. I mean, they've been a tremendous basketball program basically for the last 3 decades. And, much of that, all of it probably is credit to Jim Calhoun and what he was able to build there. But now that they're out of the Big East and they're not going to be sort of the marketed brand, they're not going to have the same branding in the American that Syracuse will continue to get as a member of the ACC, that other sort of peer programs, Louisville will get as the ACC. They're not going to have the opportunity to play in New York as much as they have in the past as a member of the monolith conference that has dominated the Northeast for the last 30 or 40 years. And I just start to wonder if from a recruiting perspective, they can kind of get lost a little bit over the next few years. So it wouldn't have surprised me if he jumped.
Yeah, I'm with you, and I think that was a concern, but I think winning it all last year,
it helps.
They were a 7 seed. But it keeps them in the minds of people as an elite team, and I think they've done a good job of scheduling now. They've been very aggressive, almost like Memphis was, but even to the nth degree. They're playing Duke this year. I know they've set up to schedule Ohio State, and I think maybe Florida. They played Florida last year. They're not going to shy away from, it's rare that we get a out-of-conference game between 2 big powers now these days that's not affiliated with some tournament or some neutral site game or whatever it is, some challenge between conferences. But UConn is certainly scheduling those. I think they'll be okay in terms of that because they were able to win last year and Ollie stayed. But again, it's going to maybe be concerning for UConn for a little bit, but I think they'll be all right now. Anything else from the coaching carousel? Bruce Pearl, as I said, Buzz Williams also adding at a high rate. Got Seth Allen, who's a nice player from Maryland. He's adding a couple transfers, a couple recruits. Both those guys working very quickly at their new schools.
Yeah, Danny Manning, right?
Yeah,
and Danny got a nice recruit the other day that at least as reported at Calipari as at one point. It's one of those things. If Calipari looked at you, right? He looked at you once, then your stock went up 10 points in the rankings on the recruiting, and Manning was able to sign someone recently. Not a huge offseason as far as that's concerned, Shane. I mean, it's going to be always interesting to see how some of these guys do at their new schools. But by and large, we're going to be talking about the guys who stuck around at their old schools.
So that's it, Randy. I mean, we've kind of recapped the summer now, kind of talked to some of the guys that left, some of the guys that stayed, both in terms of coaches and players. But ultimately, a pretty quiet summer. Not the worst thing to be controversy-free for a while. But now we have real games to talk about pretty soon, not too far away. We're on the eve of a lot of the March Madnesses, Midnight Madnesses, I should say. March Madness, not that soon. But I'm sure it'll be here before we know it. So we'll get into those, and as we kind of go through the next few weeks, we'll get into more preview stuff on the podcast, on the website. We'll do some general podcasts. We'll get into our conference preview podcast. I know the microsites are starting up. A lot of exciting things going on.
Yeah, the microsites kick off tomorrow. In fact, when you're listening to this, unless you get it up tonight and someone beats it, but Pac-12 starts on Tuesday. I believe the Big Ten and the Big 12 and the ACC will all start on Wednesday of this week, and then we'll kick off the other 26 next Monday, and then the Big East and American will come soon after that. So it's time, man. Friday, as you mentioned, is Midnight Madness on ESPNU. So we're gonna have some stuff related to that on all the microsites that have Midnight Madness events. Podcast is kicking in. We'll be back next week with more of a preview in terms of looking ahead and not looking back like we did in this one. And then we've also got a new YouTube channel. Well, it's not new. This is our second year. But we've got some new ideas that we're going to be implementing on it this year as well. And maybe some original content. We'll see how Shane holds up with everything. Maybe not on that one, but we'll see. And, yeah, it's just kind of exciting again. We're hitting mid-October. And I'm ready. I'll tell you what, I'm tired of NFL. I'm tired of football. Let's play some basketball.
Yeah, it's exciting stuff around the corner. Excited to see those, screaming fans that Frank Kaminsky wrote about in the spring. Excited to see them in the 2014-2015 season. So we're rolling everything out. And, of course, the place to check all that stuff out that we're rolling out, rushthecourt.net. It's